My name is Garrett Hollis, and I bought a Lighthouse for $800 on a Tuesday in November, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. That sounds like I'm being dramatic. I'm not. I'm a 41-year-old civil engineer from Sudbury, Ontario, and I had just handed my ex-wife the keys to the house we'd shared for 11 years, packed 2 boxes and a duffel bag into my truck, and driven north on the 69 until I stopped feeling like I needed to drive anymore. That happened to be Killarney, small town on the north shore of Georgian Bay. Population not enough to matter. I pulled into the parking lot of a Tim Hortons, ordered a large double-double, and sat in my truck for 40 minutes watching the lake. That was October. By November I had a storage unit, a short-term rental above a hardware store, and no plan that extended past the following Thursday. The Lighthouse came up on a municipal surplus auction. I wasn't looking for it. I was eating leftover chili and scrolling through my phone because I couldn't sleep, and the listing caught my eye the way things catch your eye at 2 in the morning when your defenses are down. Point Marguerite Light, built 1903, decommissioned 1971, no road access in winter. Current condition, fair to poor. Minimum bid $800. There was one photograph, a white tower with a red lantern room, sitting on a shelf of pink granite above the bay. The glass in the lantern room was intact. The attached keeper's cottage had a collapsed section of roof on the east side, and the clapboard siding had gone gray and peeling in the way old paint does when it's given up. But the tower itself looked solid. The tower looked like it had decided to outlast everything else and was succeeding. I bid $800. I told myself I was just curious to see if anyone else would bid. Nobody else bid. On the morning I took the water taxi out to see what I'd bought, the temperature was -7, and the sky was the color of old pewter. The taxi operator, a weathered man named Doug who clearly thought I'd lost my mind, dropped me at a small dock that was mostly ice and said he'd be back in 2 hours. I stood on that granite shelf and looked up at the tower and thought, what exactly did I expect to happen here? The cottage door wasn't locked. There was no lock anymore, just a hasp with the screws pulled halfway out of rotted wood. Inside, the smell hit me first. Cold damp and something older underneath it, like decades of wood smoke that had soaked into the walls and stayed there. The floor was sound in the main room. The collapsed east section turned out to be the back bedroom, where a tree branch had come through the roof sometime in the past 10 years and just stayed there, rusting into the structure. There were 2 windows with intact glass facing the bay, a cast-iron stove in the corner with a stack of old birch splits beside it that someone had left and never come back for. On the mantel above the stove were 3 things: a tin cup, a folded piece of oilcloth, and a black and white photograph in a frame so warped by moisture that the backing had bubbled away from the glass. I almost didn't look at it. I almost just set it face down. The photograph showed 2 people standing on the dock outside, the same dock I'd just arrived at, clearly, though it looked newer and the granite was clean of the orange lichen that covered it now. A man in his 30s in the kind of heavy wool shirt that working men wore in that era, and a woman beside him, not quite touching him but leaning slightly in his direction, the way people do when they want to be closer but aren't sure they're allowed. They were both squinting against the light. Neither of them was smiling, because people didn't smile in photographs back then. But there was something in the way they were standing, some quality of the space between them, that made the photograph feel like it had interrupted something private. On the back of the frame, scratched into the wood with what might have been a nail, WB+DM, June 1931. I set the photograph back on the mantel. I looked out the 2 intact windows at Georgian Bay going silver gray under the winter sky. And for the first time in 4 months, I didn't feel like I needed to be somewhere else. It took me 3 weekends and most of my accumulated vacation time to start making the cottage livable. Doug ferried out supplies and loads: plywood, tar paper, a replacement section of roofing, 2x4s, a new door handle, a bag of cement for the chimney flashing. He stopped commenting on my sanity after the second trip, which I chose to interpret as respect. The structural work on the collapsed section wasn't complicated, just cold and slow. I grew up spending summers at my uncle's place near Temagami, and I knew how to swing a hammer and read a roof and think 3 steps ahead when you're working alone, without anyone to call for a second opinion. The work was good. It was the kind of work that fills your head completely, that leaves no room for the other things. The late-night inventory of where you went wrong. The specific way your chest feels when you're driving past a restaurant you used to go to together. All of it. You can't think about any of that when you're 40 feet up a ladder in November wind trying to get a ridge cap set before the light goes. I started sleeping better. I found things in the cottage over those first weeks. Not treasures. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't that kind of story. What I found were the small material traces of someone's working life. A logbook for the light, the last entry dated September 14, 1971. A bureaucratic note about the automated light being switched on and the keeper officially relieved of duty. A pair of rubber boots under the cot in the main room. A coffee tin full of assorted nails, sorted by size, which struck me as a very particular kind of person, and in the drawer of the small desk by the north window, a stack of letters bound with a piece of twine that had dried to brittleness. I held the stack for a long moment before I untied the twine. The letters were from a woman named Dorothy, and they were addressed to William Bouchard. I knew from the Lighthouse records that W. Bouchard had been the keeper of Point Marguerite Light from 1928 to 1953. I'd looked it up after finding the photograph, out of idle curiosity, one of those Wikipedia rabbit holes you fall into at 11 at night. William had kept the light for 25 years. That was his whole working life, essentially, alone on this shelf of granite 10 kilometers from the nearest road. Dorothy's letters covered about 12 years, from 1931 to 1943. The early ones were practical. News from the mainland, updates on her family's farm near Espanola, questions about the supply boat schedule. But somewhere around 1934 or 1935, something shifted in the writing. Not dramatically. Just the way winter shifts into spring, slowly enough that you can't point to the exact day it changed. She wrote about books she was reading and wanted him to read too. She wrote about the particular quality of light on the bay on a November morning, and then she wrote, "I wonder if you see the same thing I see, from where you are." She wrote, in one letter that must have taken her a week to send, that she had started to understand that some things only make sense when you say them out loud to someone specific, and he was the someone specific for most of the things she was trying to understand. William's letters weren't in the drawer. Dorothy had kept his, or she had never had them. I couldn't know. What I had was only her side of the conversation, which is always the more incomplete and somehow the more revealing side. The last letter in the stack was dated March 93. It was very short. It said that her husband, a man named George, had come back from overseas and that she was glad he was safe and that she hoped William would understand. It said, "I think the Bay knows everything we didn't say. I hope that's enough." I sat at William's desk for a long time after I read that letter. I wasn't going to tell anyone. I'm not entirely sure why I changed my mind. Maybe it was the fact that I'd been in Killarney for 3 months and had spoken in depth to almost no one except Doug and the woman at the hardware store who had opinions about roofing cement. Maybe it was that carrying someone else's private loss on top of your own gets heavy. I called my younger sister, Bryn, on a Sunday afternoon. In February, she's a librarian in Ottawa, and she has the particular gift of listening without trying to fix things, which I needed more than I knew. She was quiet for a moment after I'd told her everything. The lighthouse, the photograph, the letters, Dorothy's final note. "Have you tried to find out what happened to either of them?" she said. I hadn't. I'd been thinking about the letters as something sealed, something that ended in 1943 and wasn't mine to extend. But Bryn pointed out gently that I now owned the place where William had lived for 25 years, and that the letters were in my possession, and that someone deserved to know they existed. "Even if there's no one left," she said, "the story deserves to be known." It took me 4 months of evenings on my laptop, a subscription to Ancestry, 3 calls to the Archives of Ontario, and 1 very helpful email exchange with a local historian in Espanola named Patrick, who knew the regional history the way only people who've devoted their retirement to a subject can know it. Dorothy Marchand had married George Alcott in 1937. They'd had 2 sons. George had died in 1979. Dorothy had died in 1998 at the age of 89, in a care home in Sudbury, which meant that in the year I was born, Dorothy Marchand was still alive and living 40 minutes from where I grew up. William Bouchard had retired from the Light in 1953. He'd lived in Killarney until his death in 1977. He had never married. Dorothy's younger son, a man named Ted Alcott, was still alive. He was 74, and he lived in Cheddle-Lemsford, which is a small community just west of Sudbury. I wrote him a letter. I didn't email. It seemed like the kind of thing that warranted a letter. I explained who I was and what I'd found, and I said that I thought the letters were his family's, and that I wanted him to have them if he wanted them. I said that from everything I'd read, his mother had been someone who expressed herself with great care and intelligence and warmth, and that I thought her writing deserved to be known by the people who came from her. He called me on a Thursday evening in June. He had his mother's quality of choosing words slowly and meaning all of them. He said that he knew the name William Bouchard, that his mother had spoken of him once when Ted was a teenager, just said that there had been a man she'd written to during a certain period of her life, and that she hoped Ted would understand someday that people contain more than one story. I always meant to ask her more about it, he said, and then I didn't, and then she was gone. I told him the letters were his. I said I'd drive them out to Chelmsford whenever he wanted. He said next Saturday would be good if I was free. I met Ted Alcott on a Saturday morning in late June. He lived in a bungalow on a quiet street with a garden that was clearly taken very seriously. His wife, a small, energetic woman named Sue, met me at the door and said Ted was out back and would I like coffee, and before I could answer there was coffee in my hand. Ted was in the garden, standing by a section of the fence that had started to list. He shook my hand and looked at the box I was carrying with a kind of stillness that told me he'd been thinking about this moment since I'd called. We sat at the picnic table while Sue tactfully disappeared. He untied the twine, I'd retied it, same knot, and he read the first letter, and then the second, and then he stopped and folded them back carefully and sat with his hands on the table. She was lonely, he said finally. Not as a criticism, as a recognition. I said that I thought she'd also been loved, in a way that outlasted what was possible. That William had kept her letters for more than 30 years after she sent them. That's not nothing. Ted looked at the letters, and then at the bay through the gaps in the fence boards. Though there was no bay here, just the neighbor's yard. He said, "My mother used to say that the things you can't finish saying still count. They're still part of the conversation." I thought about that the whole drive back to Killarney. I thought about the specific weight of things that go unsaid. Not just between Dorothy and William, but in general. The words I hadn't said to my ex-wife before things calcified into silence. The things my father never quite said to me before he died, and that I'd spent 15 years wishing I could ask him about. The letter I'd started writing to my best friend after his marriage fell apart, and never sent because I didn't know if it would help. It's a very particular kind of grief, the grief for the conversations that never happened. I think I'd been carrying it for years without knowing what it was. The lighthouse itself, the actual tower, I finished restoring in September. The lantern room glass had held through another winter, which Doug said was a minor miracle, and I chose to take as a sign. I got the light operational again, not as an official navigational aid, just a light that turns on at dusk and off at dawn, running off solar panels I'd mounted on the cottage roof. You can see it from the water taxi route. Doug told me, without quite smiling, that a few of the other operators had started using it as a reference point. I don't live there full-time. The access problem in winter is real, and I still have a job, though I transferred to a position in Parry Sound that puts me closer. I've spent maybe 30 weekends out there over the past year. I've gotten to know the bay in its different moods. The way it goes perfectly still on certain September mornings, the way the ice speaks in the deep cold, the way the light in the lantern room makes the granite look like it's lit from underneath. I had the photograph restored, the one of William and Dorothy at the dock. The conservation person in Toronto said that the base image was in better condition than the warped frame suggested, and she was able to produce a print that was clear enough to see their faces properly for the first time. Dorothy was laughing. You can see it once the image is clear. Her mouth is slightly open, and her eyes have that crinkled quality that means something genuinely struck her as funny. William isn't looking at the camera at all. He's looking at her. I sent Ted a copy. He called me after he received it and said he was going to put it on the mantle. He said his mother had a great laugh and he was glad to have the evidence. I still have the original. It's back on the mantle where I found it, in a new frame. When I'm out at the lighthouse and I light the fire in the cast iron stove, and the cottage fills with that particular smell, wood smoke and old wood, the cold coming off the bay, I look at that photograph and I think about what Ted's mother said. The things you can't finish saying still count. They're still part of the conversation. I don't know what I was looking for when I drove north in October, 2 years ago. I know I needed to go somewhere far enough away to see my own life from a distance, the way you have to step back from a painting to understand what you're looking at. I know that buying a lighthouse for $800 is not a normal way to start that process. But I also know that William Bouchard spent 25 years on a shelf of pink granite, keeping a light burning, so that people on the water could find their way. He did it alone, and he did it faithfully, and nobody much thought about it after he was done. He kept 30 years of letters in a desk drawer, which is a kind of faithfulness too. I think about that when I turn the light on at dusk. I think about what it means to keep showing up for something quietly, without an audience, because it matters. It turns out that's the only lesson I needed.